Welcome to the Tim Booker channel. Wisdom is worth spreading. Wishing you an enjoyable listening experience. Today, we're going to decode a book titled, Making Great Decisions in Business and Life. There are two books with the same title on the market, one written by a British author and one by an American author. The book we're sharing today is by the American author. I will spend approximately 30 minutes unraveling the essence of this book, teaching you how to think like an economist and make wise decisions in both work and life. The authors of this book are David R. Henderson, a researcher at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, who has previously served as a senior economist on President Reagan's Economic Advisors Council. The other author is Charles L. Hooper, the president and founder of a consulting firm and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Both of these individuals are affiliated with the Hoover Institution, a prominent U.S. public policy think tank and the world's largest repository of political, economic, and social change records. Returning to the topic of decision-making wisdom, we first need to understand what decision-making is. In essence, decision-making is about making choices between two options, A and B. The question arises, why do some decisions appear smarter while others lead to worse outcomes? What determines the quality of a decision? This is the topic we aim to discuss in this book. The authors tell us that the methods of thinking about a problem often determine the quality of a decision. So, what are these methods exactly? I've distilled this book into 3 parts. 1. The 2 fundamental pieces of knowledge we must possess when making decisions. 2. The 2 considerations to keep in mind when making decisions. 3. 3 methods for making high-quality decisions. Let's start with the first part, the foundational knowledge we need for decision-making. Each of us makes various decisions every day, and you might think we're all quite familiar with the process. However, the author believes that despite making decisions daily, it doesn't necessarily mean we know what kinds of decisions are better. The author states that when making decisions, there are 2 crucial pieces of knowledge that many people are unaware of. The first point is that when making decisions, the outcome is more important than the reasoning. In the past, we've often been taught that reason rules the world, implying that as long as we have a rational argument, any decision we make is justified. Under this logic, actions such as taking a life for a life or repaying debts are considered morally sound because they are reasoned. Why is taking a life for a life considered morally right? It's because we have a rationale for it. However, the author poses a question. Does having a rationale for an action necessarily mean we should take that action? Clearly, the answer is not always. To illustrate this point, the author gives an extreme example: 2 families in the United States engaged in a perpetual cycle of revenge killings. It all started with one person from family A killing someone from family B, and the cycle continued with revenge killings. This persisted for decades, affecting generations of both families and preventing them from leading normal lives. While each act of revenge had its rationale, it was clear that, in the long run, the best choice for both families was to cease the cycle of violence. So, sometimes, even when we believe we have a solid rationale, including one that justifies taking a life, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right choice. Why? Because, even though we have a reason, we may not have considered all the opposing reasons and viewpoints, leading us to make a judgment based on flawed reasoning. You might think the example of taking a life for a life is too extreme for our daily lives, but do we not engage in similar actions where we believe we have a rationale but, in reality, it's not a reasonable course of action? For instance, if a colleague mistreats you, and you feel unfairly treated, you may contemplate revenge. Or while driving on the highway, if another car cuts you off, you might react impulsively to get back at them. In situations like these, even if we have a valid reason to feel wronged, should we really accelerate to retaliate on the road or seek revenge at work? Is your professional future more important than workplace conflicts? Is your safety on the road less important than venting your frustration? I believe everyone knows the answer to these questions. So, just because we have a rationale or a reason doesn't mean we should make a particular decision. In fact, we might fall into a trap where we didn't have a valid reason in the first place, but after taking an action, we start inventing justifications and reasons to rationalize our behavior. This phenomenon is quite common. We often find reasons to justify our actions, not necessarily taking action because we have valid reasons as we might think. The author also shared an example from his own life. He mentioned a time when he was young and went on a date with a girl at night. One evening, They were at a bar having drinks, and afterward, he suggested going somewhere else to continue their night out. However, the girl said, "Oh, I have plans to go rowing with friends tomorrow morning, so I need to go home early today." At that moment, the author thought, well, that makes sense, but later, he realized that the girl had essentially found an excuse to justify going home early. Because if she genuinely wanted to spend more time with him, she could have done so, regardless of the rowing plans the next day. But when she wasn't interested in him, she used this as an excuse to explain why she had to leave. So, the author reminded himself that sometimes he does the same thing. He first makes a decision and then finds a reason for it, but later, he might start believing that these reasons were the original motivations for his actions. Hence, having ample reasons doesn't necessarily mean a good decision. Firstly, your reasons might not be well thought out, and secondly, your reasons might be constructed after the fact. If we don't base our decisions solely on whether we have enough reasons, how do we determine what decisions to make? Well, the author suggests we don't focus on the reasons but instead look at the therapeutic effect, meaning whether a decision is good or not doesn't depend on the reasons but rather on the outcomes. We need to evaluate the value a decision brings and the costs associated with it, and compare these factors. In other words, a good decision is one where the benefits outweigh the costs. However, calculating the costs and benefits of different options can be challenging. The author introduces the second foundational knowledge for decision-making, translating things into value. When options can't be directly compared, we quantify the value they bring and compare their values to assess their merits. Often, this quantification can be done using money as a common measure. For instance, consider whether you should spend an hour cleaning your house or working. These two options are hard to compare directly. But by quantifying their value, you can make a decision. If you earn $100 per hour working in a house cleaning service charges $50 per hour, it's clear that working would bring in more income. However, you might argue that not cleaning the house will make you feel uneasy, causing a mental loss worth $200. In this case, even though you earn $100 working, you'd still feel better if you spent $50 on the cleaning service, ending up with a total gain of $250. So, by comparing the costs and benefits of different options in this way, you can make informed choices. At this point, you might find this process subjective. Different people might place different values on the same things. For one person, not cleaning the house for a month might be tolerable, while for another, it might be unbearable. So, what's a good decision varies from person to person. But overall, the concept of how to make decisions by calculating value seems quite straightforward. As mentioned earlier, however, you need to be cautious because in the process of calculating value and making judgments, many of us fall into two pitfalls. What are these? That's what we're going to discuss in the second part today, 2 pitfalls to be aware of. So, what are these 2 pitfalls? They are, firstly, forgetting to consider opportunity cost and, secondly, overestimating sunk costs. Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Stiglitz, once said that ordinary people often fail to calculate opportunity costs, while economists can overlook sunk costs, which is indeed a significant wisdom of economists. What does this mean? When we calculate the costs of a decision, we often fail to consider opportunity costs comprehensively. For example, when we buy something, in our cost calculation, ordinary people usually only consider the direct cost. For instance, buying a 20-minute audio program priced at $4.99. Most people, when calculating the cost, would simply see the cost as $4.99 for the audio program. This is what Professor Stiglitz meant by people not considering the opportunity cost. But when you assess the true cost of a 20-minute audio program, you should factor in the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the highest value foregone when you choose one option over another. When you spend 20 minutes listening to the audio program, you miss out on the opportunity to earn money doing something else during those 20 minutes. Let's assume your highest earnings come from working, and you earn $100 per hour. Missing those 20 minutes of work equals a loss of $33. This is your opportunity cost. So, the true cost of buying one episode of the audio program is not just $4.99 but $4.99 plus the $33 in potential earnings, totaling around $38. Now you know the actual cost of one episode of the audio program. Why is it useful to calculate opportunity costs? Knowing this allows us to consider decisions more thoroughly. Sometimes, a decision may seem good or bad in isolation if you don't consider opportunity costs. But once you factor them in, you may realize that the initial decision wasn't necessarily correct. Let's say the price of the audio program, which costs $4.99 per episode, increases to $9.99. Without considering opportunity costs, you might think, wow, it went up by $5, that's a 100% increase, it's too expensive. But when you take opportunity costs into account, you'll understand that the actual cost has gone from $38 to $43, which is an increase of less than 15%. So, when making decisions, calculating opportunity costs helps us make better judgments about the quality of our decisions. Unfortunately, many people fail to consider opportunity costs, leading to inappropriate decisions in the end. Now, the second pitfall is that we often overestimate sunk costs, which is the opposite of what we discussed earlier. When making decisions, we tend to consider sunk costs, whereas economists do not. What are sunk costs? In simple terms, they are the costs incurred from past decisions that cannot be changed now or in the future. It's money spent that cannot be recovered, like water under the bridge. For example, you buy a movie ticket, but after watching 20 minutes of the film, you find it terrible. However, the cinema doesn't allow refunds. Many people might think, well, I've already spent the money, so I might as well watch it. The author suggests that in such situations, we shouldn't base our decisions on the money already spent on the non-refundable movie ticket. Instead, we should think about the future. Regardless of how much money we've spent before, we should consider what action is more worthwhile in the future. For instance, whether or not you continue watching the movie shouldn't depend on the money spent on the ticket but on what's more valuable for the time ahead. If you believe that there's nothing better to do for the next hour and it's worth sitting in the cinema, then continue watching. However, if you think that spending the next hour reading a book would be more valuable than watching the movie, then you should decisively leave the cinema and find a place to read. Don't trap yourself in a movie you don't enjoy just because of sunk costs. Similar situations occur frequently in our lives. For example, you've been with your boyfriend for 4 years, but you gradually feel that you're not compatible. However, you hesitate to break up because you think the past 4 years would be wasted. This is being stuck in the sunk costs of the past. Such situations are even more common in the workplace. For instance, you might stay in a job because you've accumulated a lot of experience and are familiar with the work. So, when faced with new opportunities, you can't let go of the past. These thoughts treat sunk costs as if they were your real costs. So, you see, we should abandon the existing, sunk, and focus on the incremental, future. To some extent, this means we should ignore sunk costs. There's a saying that captures this well: let bygones be bygones and embrace the future. Essentially, it means that, like economists, we should stop considering sunk costs that cannot be changed and instead focus on what truly deserves our attention in the future. These are the two common mistakes we often make when making decisions: not considering opportunity costs and clinging to sunk costs. Now that we know the basics of decision-making and the pitfalls to avoid, let's delve into specific methods for making decisions. This is what we're going to discuss in the third part today. The book shares many methods, but I find 3 particularly inspiring: finding the third way, the 16x rule, and using the spiritual finger method for thinking. So, what is finding the third way? When we make decisions, we often limit our thinking by existing options, which can prevent us from coming up with creative solutions. We tend to believe that the answer must come from the available options, but often, there might be better choices if we think a bit more. The third way, the author shares a personal experience from over a decade ago. He and his family were on vacation, but the hotel's pillows were extremely uncomfortable, like rocks. Everyone woke up with neck pain the next day. They considered switching to a better hotel, but when they checked, the cost of a more comfortable place was an extra $200 per day. That was a significant amount for the author at the time. So, what to do? Bite the bullet and spend an extra $200 each day, or tough it out in the current hotel? What would you do? The author found a third option. He went out, spent $20, and bought a new pillow. Look at that, the problem was solved for just a few tens of dollars. This illustrates the idea of breaking out of existing options and finding the third way. You might think that buying a pillow is too simple, something anyone could think of. However, when life scenarios change slightly, we often forget this strategy. For example, the author mentioned discovering a school that had intended to hire a new professor. Initially, all the school's management had approved the decision and agreed to hire. But in the end, they didn't hire the professor. Why? Well, after completing the approval process, they suddenly realized that all the professors' offices in the school were already occupied. Since there were no available offices, they thought there was no choice but to cancel the new hire. However, they did have a third option. As we all know, universities often have professors who go abroad for a year due to various reasons. During this time, their offices are vacant and can be used by others. Additionally, the new professor could have shared an office with professors who rarely use their office space. The author's point is that there's often a third way, but we easily trap ourselves with surface-level answers and options. Now, the question becomes, how can we better find this third way in our everyday choices? The famous playwright George Bernard Shaw once said, "Some people see things as they are and say, why? Others dream things that never were and say, why not?" We often find ourselves in the former category, merely complaining and accepting reality, having given up on finding better solutions. But we should be the ones who keep asking, why not? This mindset is crucial. So, the author suggests that we start by considering the surface-level solutions and then tell ourselves that besides these obvious options, there are likely other ways, the third way. They exist, we just need to take the time to think about them. So, this is the first strategy in our quest for finding the third way. The second useful strategy is the 16x rule. The 16x rule refers to the fact that we make various choices every day, and while these options may seem like individual choices at the moment, the results behind them can yield significantly different returns, possibly up to 16 times greater. You might be curious about how this number, 16 times, comes about. Well, this conclusion originates from the well-known 80-20 rule, also known as the Pareto principle. It suggests that 80% of the results often come from 20% of the efforts or inputs, or that 20% of the people create and enjoy 80% of the outcomes. For example, consider a company with 100 employees. Typically, 20% of these employees generate 80% of the revenue. If those 20 employees collectively earn $80, each of them averages $4. However, the remaining 80 employees together only earn $20, with an average of just 25 cents per person. The difference in impact between $4 and 25 cents is a staggering 16 times. This principle reinforces an important lesson in management: it's worth investing even 2 or 3 times the effort or resources to find an outstanding employee, because exceptional employees can ultimately yield returns that are 16 times greater. So, the 16x rule advises us that when making decisions, we should be aware that some choices are often pivotal and can result in substantial returns. We should strive to identify the most significant decision strategies with minimal costs. For example, there's a carpet rental company in the United States that applies the 16x rule. Their business involves renting carpets to companies and taking responsibility for regular cleaning and maintenance. Carpets are known to wear out quickly and are costly to replace. So, how does this carpet rental company make money? They realized and applied the 16x rule. They discovered that the wear and tear on office carpets was highly uneven. For instance, areas like hallways and corridors wore out quickly, while many other areas remained in nearly new condition even after a year. Therefore, they redesigned their carpets to allow for partial replacement. During maintenance, they only replaced the damaged sections, which typically accounted for about 10% of the entire carpet. This approach significantly reduced their costs and boosted the company's profits. This example illustrates how, when making decisions, we should differentiate the importance of various choices according to the 16x rule. We should invest more effort in decisions that have a substantial impact rather than treating all decisions equally. Of course, this principle might seem straightforward, but many management teams in companies often use the same processes and resources for $500,000 projects as they do for $5 million or $50 million projects during meetings, certainly. Here's the translation of the provided content into English. Alright, let's take a look at the third method the author shares for making decisions, the critical threshold method. The critical threshold method comes into play when we're faced with various choices, and it's challenging to compare these options directly. In such situations, we can employ reverse thinking. Start by setting a standard and think about what the cost of achieving the same goal would be for each option. By comparing the different costs of achieving the same goal, we can make better decisions. For example, the author once consulted for a company that had developed a medication for AIDS. They faced a decision: should they continue selling the medication themselves, or should they hand it over to a large pharmaceutical sales company with more expertise and a wider distribution network? Many in the company believed that the professional pharmaceutical sales company, with its extensive channels and strong marketing capabilities, would yield better sales results for their medication. However, they couldn't determine how much more the large company could sell compared to their own efforts. They were stuck and had a hard time making a decision. During this dilemma, the author used the critical threshold method to help them organize their thoughts. He asked the pharmaceutical company, if we were to hand our medication over to these large sales companies, how many more medications would they have to sell to match the revenue we generate by selling it ourselves? After calculating, they realized that the large company would need to sell more than 5 times their current sales to break even. The AIDS medication market was uniquely limited in size, and selling 5 times the current amount was nearly impossible. With this newfound clarity from the critical threshold method, the company's leadership promptly decided not to hand over the medication to the large company. Why? Because, considering the critical threshold, it became clear that the large company couldn't realistically achieve the same revenue, given the limited market size. This thinking process has various applications in our work and life. For instance, should your company handle network maintenance internally or outsource it? Should the company order takeout daily or hire a cook? In these scenarios, you can set a critical threshold and calculate which choice aligns best with your goals. Of course, when performing these calculations, remember not to forget opportunity costs and ignore silent costs. Finally, the author reminds us that when making decisions, we must also consider ethics. Why is this necessary? Well, if you follow the methods we discussed earlier and calculate the cost-benefit of various choices, you might discover that some unethical approaches yield more profits in the short term. However, the author cautions us against this. Unethical decisions may bring more profit momentarily, but each unethical action can erode trust, limiting your future choices. When people realize someone lacks ethics, all paths to success might be closed off for that person. In this context, the author quotes a message from Merck & Company, a pharmaceutical company in the United States, to its employees: ask yourself, if your actions were to appear on the front page of the New York Times, would you be proud? If not, don't do it. This serves as a reminder that decision-making must be honest and ethical. So, to recap the core content of The Wisdom of Decision-Making, to make a good decision, you must first have 2 fundamental pieces of knowledge: understanding that decisions are based not on reasons but on results, and the ability to compare different decisions by converting them into values for evaluation. Furthermore, when making decisions, don't forget opportunity costs, but also don't obsess over silent costs. Lastly, always be conscious of seeking a third option and use methods like the 16x rule and the critical threshold method to help you make better decisions. Remember, unethical decisions may yield short-term gains but can lead to long-term consequences that limit your future choices. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share with your family and friends. Wisdom is meant to be shared, opening the door to a better future. Thank you, and goodbye.